The CNN studio lights illuminated what was meant to be a routine discussion on presidential authority, but viewers were about to witness one of the most remarkable legal exchanges in recent television history. Alan Dershowitz, the well-known Harvard law professor and longtime defender of controversial figures, sat across from Representative Jasmine Crockett, a former civil rights attorney now in her second congressional term. The topic was executive privilege and its boundaries within criminal investigations. From the outset, the atmosphere was tense. Dershowitz, exuding his trademark confidence, began explaining why presidents should be afforded certain legal protections. His tone carried the weight of someone who had spent over 5 decades teaching constitutional law. When Crockett attempted to reply, Dershowitz interrupted her almost immediately. "With all due respect, Congresswoman," he said, gesturing dismissively, "this is a complex constitutional issue that takes decades of study to understand. Perhaps we should stay with the basics." The condescension was clear. The camera caught a brief flicker in Crockett's expression. Not anger, but calm and steady resolve. What followed left the studio stunned. Crockett asked a single, precise question that struck directly at the core of Dershowitz's argument. The man known for his rapid-fire rebuttals was silent for the first time in his long media career. Behind the scenes, production staff exchanged surprised looks. That exchange would soon circulate widely online, becoming one of the most replayed clips in legal and political circles. A reminder that even the most established authorities can be challenged on the consistency of their views. At 85, Alan Dershowitz had long been regarded as one of America's foremost legal minds. For more than 50 years, he had been a presence at Harvard Law School and on national television. His list of clients read like a catalog of controversy, from O.J. Simpson to Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump during his first impeachment trial. Known for his sharp intellect and confidence, Dershowitz authored dozens of books and argued multiple cases before the Supreme Court. His strength lay in framing even divisive positions as legitimate interpretations of constitutional law. His speaking style, fast, assertive, and laced with references to his experience, made him instantly recognizable. "I've been teaching constitutional law at Harvard for 50 years," was a line audiences heard often, usually used to close a debate. Yet beneath this persona was a sincere scholar who believed in his principles, even when they led to unpopular opinions. Still, critics increasingly accused him of selective reasoning, applying rigid constitutional standards for some cases while relaxing them for others. This perceived inconsistency had weakened his once unassailable reputation, though his confidence remained undiminished. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas's 30th District. In only her second term, she had already become a prominent voice on constitutional rights and civil liberties. Before her political career, she built a respected reputation as a civil rights lawyer in Texas. A graduate of the University of Houston Law Center, Crockett handled significant cases involving voting rights, police misconduct, and criminal justice reform. Her most recognized victory came in a landmark case challenging discriminatory bail systems, prompting policy reforms in several states. Unlike many lawmakers with minimal legal expertise, Crockett brought to Congress the discipline and precision of a seasoned trial attorney. She became known for her detailed preparation and composure under pressure, qualities that served her both in court and during congressional hearings. "Don't come to these discussions to perform," she once said in an interview. "I come to find the truth, and that often means cutting through the noise." The CNN debate that brought these two figures together centered on a recent Supreme Court ruling regarding executive privilege, particularly whether former presidents could continue invoking it after leaving office. Dershowitz had argued publicly for a broad interpretation of such powers, claiming they extended beyond a president's term. The debate carried high stakes. For Dershowitz, it was a chance to reaffirm his credibility after years of controversy. For Crockett, it was an opportunity to challenge what she viewed as a threat to constitutional accountability. The set was arranged in CNN's familiar debate style, 2 guests seated across from each other at a modern desk, with Anderson Cooper moderating. A red and blue backdrop gave the exchange a formal and balanced tone. Behind the cameras, producers anticipated a lively but conventional discussion. Dershowitz was a frequent guest, known for his confident, media-savvy arguments. Crockett, though newer to national broadcasts, was stepping into the arena with one of the most respected legal voices in the country. "Tonight," Cooper began, "we're discussing the boundaries of executive privilege following the Supreme Court's recent decision. Professor Dershowitz, you've taken a position that many legal scholars dispute. Could you explain your reasoning?" Dershowitz nodded with assurance. "Certainly, Anderson. Having taught at Harvard Law for 50 years, I can say that executive privilege plays a vital role in our constitutional structure. The recent decision fails to recognize the historical framework that shaped these protections." He spoke for nearly 2 uninterrupted minutes, citing legal precedents and historical examples, repeatedly referencing his own academic background. Occasionally, the camera cut to Crockett, who listened attentively, jotting down notes. "Congresswoman Crockett," Cooper said, "your response?" "Thank you, Anderson," Crockett began. "While I respect Professor Dershowitz's long career, it's important to make a clear distinction. If I may clarify something," Dershowitz interrupted, raising a finger. "The Congresswoman is relatively new to these constitutional matters, and a key principle is being overlooked here." "Professor," Cooper interjected, "please let her finish." "Of course," Dershowitz said, though his impatience was obvious. Crockett continued, explaining her interpretation of the Supreme Court's ruling. She cited direct passages from the majority opinion and demonstrated how they aligned with prior cases. Her argument was clear, structured, and rooted in both legal precedent and practical reasoning. As she spoke, Dershowitz shook his head, visibly dismissive. "That's simply not correct," he interrupted again. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, I've argued before the Supreme Court on these exact issues. The misunderstanding here is—" "Professor," Cooper interrupted again, firmer this time, "please allow Representative Crockett to finish." In the control room, the executive producer leaned forward. Typically, veteran commentators controlled these exchanges through interruptions and appeals to authority. But Crockett's calm precision, combined with Cooper's steady moderation, was changing the dynamic. "Let me simplify this," Dershowitz said, frustration showing. "Executive privilege, as I've taught for 50 years at Harvard, is—" Crockett, unbothered, stayed focused on the legal argument itself. Dershowitz interrupted repeatedly, referencing his credentials, but Crockett remained composed, organized, and unshaken. "Congresswoman," Dershowitz said after one of her detailed points, "these are complex legal ideas that can confuse even experienced attorneys. Perhaps I can simplify them, for your benefit and for the viewers." The camera caught a subtle change in Crockett's expression. Not anger, but sharp concentration, like assessing a witness who had just made an error. "Anderson," she said calmly, "I'd like to respond to that." "Please do," Cooper replied, sensing the rising tension. "Professor Dershowitz," Crockett began evenly, "you've mentioned your Harvard position 7 times in the past 6 minutes, and your Supreme Court appearances 4 times. Yet you still haven't addressed the specific language in Chief Justice Roberts' opinion that directly contradicts your argument. Understanding a principle is one thing, applying it consistently is another." A few legal journalists exchanged glances. One constitutional scholar whispered to another, "She's setting him up perfectly." "What exactly are you suggesting, Congresswoman?" Dershowitz asked, voice sharpening. "I'm not suggesting anything," Crockett replied. "I'm stating that your view of executive privilege seems to shift depending on who's invoking it." Dershowitz's face flushed. "That's completely false. My entire career has been guided by principle, not partisanship." "I appreciate that," Crockett responded evenly. "But perhaps we should look at the record." She reached for a folder on the desk. "In 2018, you argued on this very network that a sitting president could not be indicted or investigated because it would hinder his ability to serve. Correct?" "Yes," Dershowitz replied quickly. "Yet in 1998, Crockett continued, you said the exact opposite about another president, stating that no one is above the law and that a president cannot block investigations into his conduct." Dershowitz shifted in his seat. "Those were completely different situations." "Politically, yes," Crockett interjected. "But constitutionally, the same principles should apply, shouldn't they, Professor?" From the control room, the producer's voice came over the headset. "Stay on them. This is gold." Sensing he was on the defensive, Dershowitz tried to recover. "Congresswoman, you're taking my remarks out of context. Constitutional interpretation depends on the circumstances of each case." "I agree," Crockett said calmly. "Context does matter, so let's be specific about it." She turned another page in her folder. "In 2020, you stated that abuse of power isn't an impeachable offense because it isn't explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. Yet in this book," she held up one of his earlier works, "you wrote that criminal-like behavior is grounds for impeachment even if it doesn't violate a specific statute." The studio fell silent. Even the floor director froze in place. The room remained still, everyone aware they were witnessing something unusual. Cooper paused before speaking, allowing the moment to settle. Dershowitz, known for his rapid, confident rebuttals, appeared momentarily off balance. His trademark certainty wavered as Crockett carefully outlined inconsistencies spanning decades. "These positions can be aligned through proper constitutional interpretation," Dershowitz maintained, though his pace had slowed noticeably. "I'd be very interested to hear that alignment," Crockett responded, her tone calm but firm, because to many observers, including several constitutional scholars, these shifts seem guided more by the president's political party than by consistent constitutional reasoning. Dershowitz's expression stiffened. "That's an unfair assessment of my work," he replied. "I've devoted my entire career to defending constitutional principles without political bias." "With respect, Professor," Crockett said evenly, "that assertion should be measured against your own record." She turned to another page in her file. "In 2020, you argued that a president could pardon himself, calling it constitutionally valid. Yet, in 1974, you wrote that self-pardons would erode the Constitution." The camera caught Dershowitz's face, irritation mixing with visible discomfort. The tone had clearly changed. Guests usually deferred to his authority or became defensive, but Crockett did neither. She continued, methodically exposing contradictions with precise composure. For the first time in years, Dershowitz found himself cornered, unable to rely on his familiar tactics. The tension in the studio grew sharp. Cooper glanced at the producer off-screen, signaling for the exchange to continue. This was rare. Television, a genuine intellectual clash that demanded accountability in legal discourse. "The Congresswoman is making personal attacks rather than addressing my arguments," Dershowitz protested, his voice rising slightly. "I'm quoting your own statements." "Professor," Crockett replied steadily, "assessing them for consistency isn't personal. It's about examining the basis of your claims." She closed her folder deliberately and met his eyes. The studio fell silent as she prepared to ask the question that would silence him. She had been leading up to this moment all along. Leaning slightly forward, her voice steady, Crockett asked, "After 50 years of teaching constitutional law, Professor Dershowitz, which interpretation should the American people trust? The one that benefits Republicans, or the one that favors Democrats?" The clarity of the question lingered in the air. For a long moment, no one moved. Cooper's raised eyebrows signaled his recognition of the question's precision. Dershowitz, rarely without a retort, opened his mouth, then closed it again. Seconds passed, agonizingly long on live television. Cameras captured every detail. His widening eyes, the faint flush across his cheeks, the subtle tightening of his jaw. Here was one of America's most celebrated legal minds, momentarily speechless. In the control room, the executive producer whispered, "Stay on him. Don't cut away." They knew this was television history unfolding. When Dershowitz finally spoke, his tone lacked its usual command. That's an unfair reading of my work," he stammered. "My interpretations are..." His explanation rested on constitutional principles rather than partisanship, but the damage was already done. Millions had seen his hesitation, and even he could hear how unconvincing his defense sounded. Crockett didn't rush. She allowed the silence to settle, a courtroom technique she had mastered when witnesses exposed their own contradictions. "With respect, Professor," she said evenly, "I didn't ask about your motives. I asked which of your opposing interpretations the American people should believe, because they can't both be true. Sensing the weight of the exchange, Cooper stepped in carefully. Professor Dershowitz, would you like to respond directly to the Congresswoman's question? Dershowitz tried to recover. Constitutional interpretation evolves with time. My thinking progresses as I study precedents and historical context more deeply. Interesting, Crockett replied. But that doesn't explain why your evolution consistently aligns with the political interests of whoever you're defending. Turning to the camera, she addressed viewers directly. This isn't about Professor Dershowitz personally. It's about the credibility of our constitutional debate. When legal experts present partisan views as neutral interpretation, it damages the rule of law. Behind the cameras, journalists typed furiously. One whispered. She just did what 100 interviewers couldn't. Expose the core contradiction without attacking him personally. Dershowitz tried to deflect. The Congresswoman is performing for the cameras rather than engaging with serious constitutional questions, he said. I'm citing your own published words, Professor, Crockett answered calmly. If that's performing, the problem isn't the question, it's the inconsistency of your record. The production team exchanged quick glances and subtle smiles. Even Cooper's practiced neutrality showed a brief flicker of respect. My interpretations of executive privilege and presidential power are grounded in decades of scholarship, Dershowitz insisted, trying to reassert authority. Perhaps, Crockett conceded, but that doesn't change the fact that your conclusions seem to shift depending on which political party benefits. That's not scholarship. It's advocacy presented as analysis. Opening her folder, she continued. In 1998, you wrote that obstruction of justice was impeachable. In 2019, you argued it wasn't. That's not constitutional growth. It's adapting your stance to defend different clients. Those cases were contextually different, Dershowitz replied, though his voice lacked conviction. The only consistent difference, Crockett said, closing her folder deliberately, is the president's party affiliation. Professor, I respect your work, she added, but there's a clear line between evolving through understanding and changing positions to suit your client's needs. Dershowitz flushed. You're oversimplifying complex issues. No, Professor, Crockett interjected firmly. I'm asking a straightforward question about a long-standing pattern, and your inability to answer says a lot. In the control room, producers debated whether to end the segment to spare further embarrassment or continue airing the gripping exchange. Making one last appeal to authority, Dershowitz said, Congresswoman, I've taught constitutional law at Harvard for 50 years and argued more Supreme Court cases than you've probably read. Viewers know who holds greater expertise. Crockett remained calm. I'm not questioning your credentials, Professor. I'm questioning the consistency of your reasoning. Citing authority isn't a substitute for addressing contradictions. Turning slightly to Cooper, she added, Notice how, when faced with decades of conflicting statements, the professor doesn't reconcile them. He reminds us of his resume. Recognizing the significance of the moment, Cooper followed up. Professor Dershowitz, how would you respond to that concern? Dershowitz began a prepared statement on constitutional complexity when Representative Crockett interjected politely. Professor, she said evenly, let's be clear. This isn't about theory. It's about a guiding principle, consistency. She met his eyes directly. When you tell Americans that a sitting president is immune from investigation in 2019, yet argued the opposite in 1998, you're not clarifying constitutional law. You're using your expertise to defend partisan interests. Her framing left Dershowitz with few options. He couldn't deny his past remarks. They were a matter of record, nor could he justify such a shift as a natural evolution that coincidentally favored one political side, and dismissing Crockett as uninformed was impossible. She clearly understood both his writings and constitutional doctrine. The American people deserve better, Crockett continued, turning toward the audience. They deserve scholars who apply the same standards no matter who's in office, analysis driven by principle, not politics. And they deserve honesty about where interpretation ends and advocacy begins. The studio fell silent. Even the production crew, typically active behind the scenes, paused. They knew they were witnessing something rare, a calm, precise challenge to an entire approach to constitutional commentary on live television. Dershowitz, visibly uncomfortable, looked toward Anderson Cooper for support. Recognizing the gravity of the moment, Cooper asked, "Professor, would you like to respond to the Congresswoman's point about consistency and interpretation?" "I've always followed the Constitution," Dershowitz replied, though his voice wavered. "Different situations require different applications of principles." "That would be understandable," Crockett acknowledged, "if those differences aligned with facts, not political convenience. Americans can tell when principles are genuine and when they're manipulated. They deserve experts who respect that intelligence." Sensing the exchange had reached its natural end, Cooper concluded, "We'll take a break. Professor Dershowitz, Congresswoman Crockett, thank you for a thoughtful discussion." As the camera began to fade, Crockett added calmly, "This isn't about Professor Dershowitz or myself. It's about whether we, as a society, demand consistency from those interpreting the Constitution, regardless of partisanship. The Constitution deserves that respect, even when the conclusions are politically uncomfortable." The camera caught Dershowitz's expression, a blend of frustration and reluctant admiration. For perhaps the first time in years, he was left speechless, not by hostility, but by the clarity of his own conflicting statements presented respectfully and factually. In the control room, producers reviewed the footage. They realized they had captured something extraordinary, a legal debate transformed into a lesson on accountability, demonstrating how authority can be questioned through evidence and principle rather than emotion or attack. The impact of the Crockett-Dershowitz exchange extended far beyond CNN's studio. Within hours, clips of the debate spread rapidly across social media, gathering millions of views and thousands of comments. What set the moment apart wasn't just the silence of a renowned legal scholar, but Crockett's disciplined, respectful approach in exposing years of inconsistency in his constitutional arguments. Law students and educators hailed the exchange as a teaching moment. At Harvard Law School, where Dershowitz had taught for decades, students reportedly debated the encounter passionately. One constitutional law professor told the Harvard Crimson, "This discussion has generated more meaningful conversation about consistency in constitutional interpretation than anything I've witnessed in years." Students analyzed the statements closely, comparing them over the decades to see whether the principles had been applied consistently or selectively. The discussion soon evolved into a case study on the ethics of legal commentary. Analysts across media platforms took note. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow described the exchange as a masterclass in challenging authority without resorting to personal attacks. Even conservative commentator Andrew McCarthy of National Review admitted, regardless of one's politics, Congresswoman Crockett's method of addressing inconsistency should serve as a model for substantive debate. On social media, users engaged in unusually thoughtful conversations, sharing clips and examples of other public figures who had shifted their positions depending on political alignment. Crockett's national presence grew rapidly. Within 48 hours, her office received thousands of emails, not just from supporters, but from Americans across the political spectrum, praising her disciplined and principled questioning. One message from a conservative attorney in Ohio read, "I deeply disagree with your politics, but your commitment to constitutional consistency transcends partisanship. We need more of that kind of intellectual honesty." Law students were especially inspired. Membership in constitutional law societies soared, and applications for Crockett's congressional internship program tripled. A Yale law student told The Washington Post, "Watching that exchange reminded me why I wanted to study law, not to win arguments, but to uphold principles consistently." Across the country, law schools added the exchange to their curricula, exploring the balance between advocacy ethics and interpretation. For Dershowitz, the aftermath was more complex. Initially, some supporters argued that Crockett had taken his comments out of context. But as the full exchange circulated, including moments where he struggled to reconcile contradictory positions, even longtime admirers began questioning his reasoning. His image as an unquestioned authority in cable news analysis subtly shifted. Hosts no longer relied solely on his credentials. They began asking tougher questions about consistency and expecting substantive answers rather than appeals to reputation. Media. Training firms soon integrated the Crockett-Dershowitz exchange into their programs. Crisis communications expert Jennifer Martinez noted in a viral LinkedIn post, "Notice how Representative Crockett never raised her voice, never made it personal, and always returned to documented statements." That's the essence of effective, evidence-based accountability. The influence extended beyond media training into legal education. Columbia, Georgetown, and Yale introduced new modules on professional ethics and the responsibility of commentators to maintain consistent principles. Professor Maria Gonzalez at Georgetown observed that enrollment in her ethics courses had doubled, attributing it to students' growing interest in the tension between advocacy and honest analysis. Several legal commentators began addressing potential contradictions in their own statements, publishing clarifications and reconciling evolving views. Meanwhile, news networks faced increased pressure to scrutinize inconsistencies among their experts. CNN's internal analytics revealed that the Crockett-Dershowitz segment had generated more engagement than any previous legal discussion in network history, showing that audiences were drawn to substance over spectacle. Digital media analyst Jennifer Patel explained, "For years, networks assumed viewers wanted conflict and drama, but this data shows a real appetite for principled, evidence-based debate." 3 weeks later, Dershowitz, who rarely responded to criticism, published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal titled "Constitutional Consistency and the Evolution of Legal Thought." He wrote, "Recent public discourse has..." He acknowledged that his earlier writings had prompted valid questions about consistency and constitutional interpretation. "While I stand by my analyses in each case," he wrote, "I recognize that both personal and political influences can affect even the most disciplined legal thinker. A lifelong dedication to the Constitution requires ongoing self-reflection to ensure that principles, not preferences, direct our reasoning." The op-ed marked a rare admission from someone long known for staunchly defending his positions. In the following months, Dershowitz's tone subtly evolved. He began addressing contradictions between his past and current views with greater transparency, offering reasoned explanations instead of dismissing criticism outright. Scholars quickly seized on the viral exchange as a model for examining legal ethics and public dialogue. At Yale Law School, Professor James Wilson integrated the full interview into his professional responsibility course, noting to his students, "This discussion illustrates that accountability and meaningful critique can coexist without resorting to personal attacks or partisan bias." Journalism schools followed suit. Columbia University launched a workshop titled "Beyond Gotcha: Substantive Accountability in Public Discourse," emphasizing Crockett's structured and evidence-based questioning of authority. The exchange became widely cited as a teaching tool for interview techniques that favored substance over spectacle. More importantly, it reshaped how the public perceived constitutional debate. Polls taken weeks later revealed that 68% of Americans who viewed the segment expressed newfound interest in understanding the consistent application of constitutional values across political lines. Media analyst David Chen commented, "For years, legal commentators were judged mainly on credentials and rhetorical strength. Representative Crockett showed that long-term consistency is just as vital to credibility." 6 months later, the conversation's influence persisted. Law schools noted growing enrollment in courses focused on constitutional interpretation. Leading analysts began openly addressing how their own views had evolved while reaffirming the principles that endured. During Supreme Court confirmation hearings, senators from both sides started questioning nominees about their commitment to consistency in constitutional interpretation. One senator even referenced the Crockett-Dershowitz exchange directly, asking, "How can Americans trust that your legal interpretations are rooted in stable principles rather than shifting outcomes? What safeguards do you use to ensure consistency?" By that point, the confrontation had moved far beyond a viral TV moment. It had sparked a deeper rethinking of what defines legal expertise in modern America. Amid widespread polarization, it offered a roadmap for principled disagreement, demonstrating that accountability, handled with discipline, can strengthen public dialogue instead of weakening it. Law textbooks soon incorporated the exchange as a cornerstone example in ethics. One popular casebook added a chapter titled Consistency Across Political Divides. The ethical responsibility of legal commentators, analyzing how Crockett's deliberate questioning exposed essential issues of bias and objectivity for students, professionals and citizens navigating complex media environments. Ultimately, the exchange served as a powerful reminder. The most effective challenge to inconsistent authority isn't louder rhetoric. It's solid evidence and an unwavering commitment to principle. As new constitutional debates emerged ahead of the next election cycle, the Crockett-Dershowitz moment endured as proof that real accountability doesn't depend on hostility or partisanship. It depends on clarity, logic, and integrity. The broader takeaway for civic life was clear. True media literacy grows not from scoring political points, but from valuing consistent standards and holding even the most respected figures accountable to their words. Millions had watched and reflected. The impact on legal education, journalism, and public discourse would echo for years. Crockett's composed, precise questioning had turned a typical policy debate into a landmark in public accountability. Dershowitz's silence, both striking and revealing, served as a quiet testament. No legacy, however celebrated, stands beyond examination when consistency is the measure. It was a masterclass in holding authority to the same standards it proclaims, proving that integrity and evidence endure where theatrics fade.